Okay, hello everybody. My name is Brian Cook. I'm an air pollution specialist here at CARB. Welcome to today's webinar on reporting updates for the regulation for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from gas-insulated equipment. I'm joined today by Mary Jane Coombs, the Chief of the Project Assessment Branch, Carrie Bylan, Manager of the branch's Energy Section, and my colleague Lon Ma. We'll start today with a presentation during which all participants will be placed on mute. At the end of our presentation, we will have a Q&A session where audience members can ask questions aloud. To ask a question, click on the raise hand icon on the GoToWebinar toolbar on your screen. Carrie will call on audience members who raise their hands, and once called upon, you will need to unmute yourself by clicking on the red microphone icon. If we are unable to respond to your question today, or if you have additional questions after the webinar, please follow up with us via email. The presentation slides and a video recording of this webinar will be posted on our website soon. For starters, just a reminder that the regulation for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from gas-insulated equipment became effective January 1st of 2022, replacing the regulation for reducing sulfur hexafluoride emissions from gas-insulated switchgear. Today's webinar will include several parts. We'll start with a summary of revised regulatory concepts, including the new terminology that you'll see in the revised data year 2022 through 2024 reporting form. Then we'll pull up a copy of the revised form and show how to complete it through a live demonstration. We'll then switch back to PowerPoint slides where we'll cover common reporting errors and explain the process for amending prior year reports. Finally, we'll have our Q&A session. This slide describes the gases and equipment types required to be reported under the regulation. In recognition of emerging technologies, the regulatory amendments broadened the scope of gases covered. The original regulation only required tracking and reporting of SF6, whereas the amended regulation applies to all covered insulating gases. Covered insulating gases are those with a GWP greater than 1. GWP is a metric that describes the potency of a greenhouse gas relative to carbon dioxide over an established time period. The GWP of carbon dioxide is 1, and the GWP of SF6 used in this regulation is 22,800. Some values must be reported in units of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or MtCO2e. Equations throughout the regulation explain how to convert values measured in pounds to this unit of measure, and a lot of these conversions are automated for you in the annual reporting form. Some of the gases that could be used in place of SF6 are actually blends of multiple gases, and only the constituent members of gas blends that are covered insulating gases are to be reported. For example, if you emit 100 pounds of a gas blend that consists of 5% covered insulating gas, you would only report the 5 pounds of covered insulating gas, not 100 pounds of the blend. The recent amendments also changed the term used to describe the electrical equipment covered by the regulation to gas-insulated equipment, or GIE, instead of gas-insulated switchgear. This change does not affect the type of equipment covered, it just clarifies that switchgear are not the only electrical equipment covered. By definition, GIE includes all electrical power equipment that provide insulating and/or interrupting functions regardless of insulating medium. The term GIE, therefore, includes, for example, equipment that use SF6, alternative gases, vacuum, and solid dielectric mediums. While these are all considered GIE, only those GIE that use covered insulating gas are required to be reported. Every GIE device has a capacity, which is the amount of covered insulating gas it is designed to contain while operating. Under the original regulation, the capacity of each device was established by the manufacturer, typically on the nameplate. CARB staff heard from stakeholders that the capacity specified on manufacturer nameplates may be inaccurate. Therefore, under the amended regulation, the capacity of GIE acquired and activated after December 31st of 2021 will be determined using a new method called Covered Insulating Gas at Activation, or CIGA. CIGA is calculated by summing the amount of gas added to a device during the activation process and the amount inside the device when it was acquired. For all GIE for which CIGA is not required to be calculated, For example, those acquired on or before December 31st of 2021, CEGA will equal the manufacturer's nameplate capacity. Average system capacity is another concept we wanted to highlight. It represents the amount of a covered insulating gas within active GIE, as defined in the regulation, over the course of a year. It is measured in pounds and calculated following the method in section 95353B, the equation shown here. To calculate average system capacity, you multiply the CEGA of each device that was active at some point during the data year, represented by the term CK, J, by the number of days it was active, represented by lowercase d, k, j, and then divide the result by the number of days in the data year, capital D sub I. As directed by the sigma symbol, you then sum the results for all GIE that were active at some point during the data year. The result is your average system capacity, or C average, J, I in the equation on your screen. Finally, we wanted to remind you that average CO2e capacity, which serves as the basis for calculating your emissions limit for data years 2022 to 2024, is just average system capacity converted to units of MtCO2e using the conversion specified in the regulation. Each GIE owner's emissions limit is specific to their operations and is calculated using the equation at the top of this slide. It depends on their annual emission factor, or AEF, their average CO2e capacity, and their early action credit. The AEF is based on the GIE owner's average CO2e capacity. Through 2034, the AEF is 1.0 for GIE owners with an average CO2e capacity greater than or equal to 10,000 MtCO2e, and the AEF is 2.0 for GIE owners whose average CO2e capacity is less than 10,000 MtCO2e, as shown in this table. Furthermore, there's a minimum emissions limit of 50 MtCO2e. The amended regulation specifies that previously active GIE are considered removed from regular use when covered insulating gas is extracted, which must be within 1 year of the device being inactive for 5 consecutive years, or inactive for less than 5 years but being removed from the GIE owner's inventory, or being taken out of active service for the purpose of removal from the GIE owner's inventory. Sometimes GIE in active service are transferred from one GIE owner to another. In this case, the device is considered transferred while in use in the data year in which it changes hands. Gas extraction is not required when this occurs. While using CEGA, which we discussed a few slides ago, will make the capacity of GIE acquired and activated after December 31st of 2021 more accurate, CEGA equals the manufacturer's nameplate capacity for all other existing GIE. Therefore, a separate, optional nameplate capacity adjustment process has been added to the regulation and can be used to establish more accurate capacity values. GIE owners may begin to use this optional process at any time. The first step is to notify CARB of the intention to perform nameplate capacity adjustments, which includes a list of GIE that the owner will put through the process. The required components of the notification are listed in section 95357.2A1 and are included on our webpage. Once a GIE owner has notified CARB they intend to perform nameplate capacity adjustments, they must follow the process described in section 95357.2C for each GIE device listed in the notification. In the third step, for each GIE device that has undergone the process and will remain in active service, and for which the revised nameplate capacity differs from the original nameplate capacity, the GIE owner must affix a capacity label to the device that meets the requirements of section 95357.2D. The label must be affixed by the end of the calendar year in which the process was completed and not obscure the manufacturer's label. Finally, GIE owners are to begin reporting the adjusted capacity value starting in the data year the measurement was performed. So for example, if the measurement was performed April 1st of 2022, the new value would be used in the data year 2022 report. Once a revised capacity has been established It may only be adjusted again if there is a change to the physical capacity of the device. For example, if a bushing was replaced that causes a change in the device's capacity. Finally, there is no time limit relative to the timing of the initial notification by which nameplate capacity adjustments must be completed. We'll now switch gears a little bit and talk about the revised reporting form. The new form is available for download either from our webpage or CalEGRIT, as shown in the screenshots here. The CalEGRIT software is also ready to accept reports. We're going to pull up our webpage and show you that to download the reporting form from our page, from this home page, you will need to click on Annual Reporting, either from the left-hand navigation bar or Instructions for Annual Reporting in the feature box. Once on the Annual Reporting page, we will soon be posting supplemental reporting instructions here. You will also find resources such as how to create a CalEGRIT account, how to submit a report, and a link to download the latest version of the reporting form. We'll now pull up CalEGRIT, and because most GIE owners use CalEGRIT to submit their report, those entities can download the form here by logging into their CalEGRIT account, which we've already done, selecting their facility for data year 2022, and then picking the SF6 GIS subpart and clicking the download form link. The next two slides provide a brief summary of the major changes we made to the reporting form for this year. We will show you these in our live demonstration after these slides. Most important, we want to draw your attention to the fact that the first action you need to do in the reporting form is to enter the data year and each covered insulating gas used on the Facility Info tab. That tab is shown here, and as you can see, we added the words "Start Here" to draw your attention to this step. The data year is the field at the top, and the covered insulating gases would go in the table right below it. We'll explain why this is important to do first during the live demo. Also, the previous reporting form's gas-insulated equipment tab has been broken into two, one for hermetically sealed equipment and one for non-hermetically sealed ones. This was mainly done because a number of the new reporting requirements apply to hermetically sealed or non-hermetically sealed equipment only, and this format seemed more intuitive. Within those tabs, you'll see for the first time a drop-down menu for equipment type. This was added in an attempt to improve consistency in naming conventions used, but if you don't see your equipment type listed in the drop-down menu, you can select Other and then enter the equipment type yourself. We call this detail out to ensure you allow adequate time prior to your report submission to use the correct terms for your reported GIE. There are also new fields where you'll report if the device is jointly owned, and if it is, you will enter your company's equity share and information about co-owners. Further, there are new fields that only apply to GIE acquired after December 31st of 2021. You will report for each device whether it was acquired after this date or not, and for those that were, additional data is required. Finally, GIE device operational status changes must be reported. These details include indications of whether the device was active at both the beginning and end of the year, and whether it was activated for the first time or removed from regular use during the data year. The gas containers and carts tab has also been revised. You must report whether the vessel is a container or a cart, and whether it is owned by or stored on the property of the GIE owner or not. You'll also provide the type of gas the vessel is designed to contain and the amount of gas it had at the beginning of the year, which is the amount it was reported to have at the end of the prior year. There's a new tab where you'd report emissions from CARB approved emergency event exemptions if you had any. There's also a new tab for reporting system capacity, emissions, and emissions limit info. Some of this was reported on the form's Facility Information tab in prior years, and data required to be reported has been expanded to include all inputs used to calculate the emissions. We also have a new tab where you'd report information on each nameplate capacity adjustment you performed during the data year, if any. Finally, there are several data elements previously required to be reported that are no longer. These include the size and location of each gas container and certain transfers. For the transfers, rather than reporting a GIE serial number, date, and amount of gas transferred for all gas transferred into or out of GIE during the data year, you'll now just have to report transfers associated with GIE activation or retirement. Okay, we'll now pull up a copy of the reporting form and do the live demo. We'll start by walking through the new reporting form, showing how the new requirements map to the data fields. Then we'll enter some data live to demonstrate the form's functionality. First, we'll proceed through this form's tabs from left to right. Upon opening the file, you'll see the Instructions tab. Please review this information carefully before completing your report. Note that we've included links both to the regulatory text and the more detailed reporting instructions, which we'll post soon, here at the top. The reporting instructions will be posted in the coming days. The Reporting Forms Instructions tab directs you to enter a data year and at least one covered insulating gas on the Facility Info tab as a first step before entering any other data. And as noted here, the spreadsheet is equipped with data validation checks that flag potential errors, giving you an opportunity to address the errors before the report is submitted. We'll show an example data validation check later. These checks work best when data are directly entered instead of copied and pasted, so please enter data directly where possible. If you must copy and paste data into the form, please ensure your source data exactly matches allowed options when pasting into a field that has a drop-down menu. If you use paste special values, you will preserve some, but not all, reporting form functionality. Moving on, there isn't any information you need to enter on the version history tab, so we'll proceed to Facility Info, where data entry begins. All the tabs where you enter data include some brief instructions at the top that are specific to that tab. Please read all these instructions carefully. These instructions may tell you to leave fields that don't apply blank, or to enter a value in all fields, including fields for which the measured value is 0. For this tab, you should complete all applicable fields and leave any that do not apply blank. The first field you'll see is the data year, which, as mentioned, you should fill out first. We anticipate this version of the form will be used for 2022, 2023, and 2024 reporting, so you'll see those options in the reporting year drop-down menu. We'll select 2022. The year is important to select early in the reporting process because some of the form's validation checks will ensure the data you enter makes sense based on the year you're reporting for. Next, you would enter all the covered insulating gases present in GIE, gas containers, and/or gas carts during the data year. The gas is GWP, and if the covered insulating gas is used in a blend, the mass share of the covered insulating gas within that blend. For example, we'll select both SF6 and perfluoroisobutyronitride, which is a gas that may take the place of SF6 in some applications in the coming years. If you don't use this gas, you shouldn't pick it from the list. You may know this gas by its chemical formula, C4F7N, or its common name in the industry, Novec 4710. In the unlikely event that you are using a covered insulating gas not included in our drop-down menu, you can just type it in. We'll enter one as an example, ABC gas. Notice that because the first two gases are specified in the drop-down menu, their GWPs are automatically filled in. For each gas that you manually enter, you will have to also provide the GWP. We'll enter the number 2 here. Finally, in this section, if the covered insulating gas is a blend of multiple gases, you'd enter the mass share of the covered insulating gas within that blend expressed as a decimal. For example, if C4F7N comprises 5% of the blend, you'd enter 0.05. If you use more than one type of blend and each has a different mass share of C4F7N, you'd enter the applicable mass shares for each separated by a comma. As you proceed through the names, addresses, and contact information shown here, please enter information in all the applicable fields. One thing to look out for at the very end is a field required to be completed by all reporters, notifying CARB if the reporting entity either combined into or split from other entities since the prior year's report submission. See sections 95353I and J for regulatory provisions on combining and splitting of GIE owners. If we enter yes, you'll see a pop-up message explaining how to submit additional information required by the regulation. We'll now proceed to the hermetically sealed GIE tab. As mentioned, one of the changes to the form this year is the gas-insulated equipment tab has been broken into two, one for hermetically sealed GIE and one for non-hermetically sealed GIE. Per the instructions at the top of this tab, you should enter data for all hermetically sealed GIE owned at some point during the data year and leave this blank if you have none to report. This tab includes a number of fields that you've been required to report in prior years, including serial number, equipment type, seal type, and manufacturer. The equipment type column has undergone a small change. It now includes the drop-down menu I mentioned earlier with the common equipment types. And if you don't see your equipment type listed, you should select Other, and then enter the device type in the next column. Because hermetically sealed GIE and non-hermetically sealed GIE are reported on separate tabs now, the form will automatically fill in the seal type, both here and on the non-hermetically sealed GIE tab. Another change for this year is that you only need to report the year each device was manufactured instead of a specific date. Voltage capacity and nameplate capacity appear next. Those are not new this year. Next, we have covered insulating gas and the gas's GWP. These fields are new this year. Note the drop-down menu in the gas column includes all the gases we entered on the facility info tab. That's why it's important to enter that information first. We'll select SF6 for one of these pieces of equipment, and notice that after that, the GWP automatically populates, again matching what was entered on the facility info tab. Also new are columns K through M, in which you'll indicate if equipment are jointly owned and provide related information if they are. Note columns L and M are grayed out by default, indicating data entry is not yet required. In column K, if you report your device is not jointly owned, your equity share will automatically display as 100% in column L, and you do not need to enter the names and equity shares of co-owners. However, if the device is jointly owned, you will need to complete both columns L and M. There are also new reporting requirements that only apply to equipment acquired after December 31st of 2021. So if you indicate that your device was acquired after this date in column N, columns O through R will turn green, and you'll need to fill them out. Otherwise, they'll remain gray and you should skip them. Those fields are the date the device was acquired and purchased, its short circuit current rating in units of kiloamperes, and whether it's used above or below ground. Note that the words acquire and purchase are both defined in the regulation. The final three columns capture some operational details for each device. In each, you would just enter yes or no to indicate if the device was connected to the electrical power system on January 1st and December 31st, and whether it was still owned on December 31st. We'll now proceed to the non-hermetically sealed GIE tab. First of all, as mentioned at the top of this tab, you should enter data for all non-hermetically sealed GIE owned at some point during the data year. You should leave this tab blank if you have none to report. Also, for GIE acquired after December 31st of 2021, you should enter all required data, including the number 0 if applicable. Do not just leave the information blank. Columns A through R appear both here and on the hermetically sealed GIE tab that we just went over, so we'll skip those. Just like columns O through R, columns S through U are only required for non-hermetically sealed GIE acquired after December 31st of 2021. They are grayed out by default and turn green if you select yes back in column N. This would indicate that they were acquired after December 31st of 2021. Columns S and T are the amount of covered insulating gas in the GIE device when it was acquired and the amount of additional gas added during activation, if applicable. You should enter 0 in column T if the device has not yet been activated or if there was no gas added during activation. If gas was added to the device when activated, enter the date that gas was added in column U. That brings us to column V, covered insulating gas at activation, or CIGA. For GIE acquired and made active after December 31st of 2021, this value is the amount of gas inside the device when acquired, plus the additional amount of gas added for activation. For all other GIE, CIGA is the nameplate capacity. Following these rules, the form will automatically calculate CIGA for you. The rest of the columns to the right provide more specificity on operational status than the previous reporting form did, where there was just a single column named GIS status. Most of these fields are intuitive. You will just pick yes or no from the drop-down menus to indicate whether each device was active on January 1st and December 31st, and whether it was still owned on December 31st. Note that to qualify as active GIE, a device must meet the definition provided in the regulation. Column Z, the last date the device was active, is only required if you indicated in column X that the device was not active on December 31st of the data year. Of note, columns W through Y refer to the data year for which you are reporting, but the date you enter in column Z could be from a prior year, if the device was last active in a prior data year. Next, in column AA, you would report the number of days the device was active during the data year. In column AB, you will need to use the drop-down menu, which will show here, to specify if any of the listed operational status changes occurred during the data year. Note the options include single actions or combinations of actions, so please be sure to read the drop-down menu options fully before choosing one. Note these terms are defined in the regulation. And if none of the status changes listed apply to the GIE device, leave this field blank. Finally, for equipment that you indicated in column AB were removed from regular use during the data year, you need to enter the amount of gas that was transferred out of the device in column AC. This column will appear gray unless you indicate in column AB that the device was removed from regular use. We'll now go on to the Early Action Credit tab. As noted at the top, completion of this tab is optional. Per section 95353D, regulated entities may accrue early action credit starting in 2021 for each circuit breaker that meets the following criteria. First, it must have been activated for the first time between January 1st of 2021 and the phase-out date for an equivalent SF6 GIE device. Second, it must have a voltage capacity of 72.5 kV or greater. Third, it must not be insulated with SF6 or oil. And fourth, it must not have been removed from regular use or transferred while in use. If you have any equipment that meet all of these conditions, you can report them here and your emissions limit will reflect this credit. Note that all equipment eligible for the credit, including those activated in prior data years, should be reported here. Most of this tab is the same as last year, but we added columns L through P to gather required information for equipment acquired after December 31st of 2021, just like we have on the hermetically sealed and non-hermetically sealed GIE tabs. Now we'll move on to gas containers and carts. This tab captures a current and complete inventory of covered gas containers and gas carts that contain covered insulating gas. You must enter data for all such vessels owned by, stored on the property of, and or used at some point during the data year. Requirements for weighing containers and carts differ for those that are owned by or stored on your property and those that are not, so please review the regulatory requirements carefully. As noted at the top, you should leave this tab blank if you have no such vessels to report. Also in columns H and I, if the measured amount of covered insulating gas was 0, enter 0. Column A is new this year. You must specify whether each vessel is a gas container or a gas cart using the drop-down menu. Column B is also new. You now have to report whether or not the vessel is owned by or stored on the property of your company. In column C, you will enter the gas container or cart ID as you've done in the past. Columns D and E are also new. In these, you must report the covered insulating gas in GWP using the drop-down menu as we've shown on other tabs. The regulation requires the amount of covered insulating gas in containers and carts be measured at specific points in time, and you will enter the date of the measurement in column F and the reason for it in column G. Next, in column H, you would report the amount of gas in the vessel when measured, as you've done in prior years. Finally, another new field is the amount of covered insulating gas in the vessel at the beginning of the data year, which would obviously only apply to vessels that were owned by or stored on the GIE owner's property in the prior data year. Note that, if reported, this value should match the end of calendar year weight for the same container or cart included in the previous year's annual report. Before we proceed, we'll demonstrate one aspect of this tab, the interplay between column B, where you indicate if the container or cart is owned by or stored on the property of the GIE owner, and G, where you enter the reason for measuring the amount of gas inside the container or cart. For example, if we select yes in column B, indicating it is owned by our company or stored on its property, note that in column G, I'm given 3 possible reasons for weighing the container that I can pick from. Conversely, if we select no in column B, we see 2 different options in column G. As such, when completing this tab, please fill out column B for each container or cart before working on column G. The different pick lists exist because the regulation requires containers owned by or stored on the GIE owner's property be weighed for different reasons than those that are not. Next, we'll move on to emergency events. This tab is new for 2022. You would report all CARB approved exemptions for emergency events that occurred during the data year. See the regulation for definitions and regulatory requirements related to such events. As noted, you should leave this tab blank if there are none to report. If you have any CARB approved emergency event exemptions to report, you would select the gas that was emitted from the drop-down menu. The form would automatically fill in the GWP, and you'd enter the emissions value associated with this event as approved by CARB. Next up is emissions and emissions limit. As the name indicates, on this tab you'll enter emissions limit and emissions related data. The names of the gases we entered on the facility info tab automatically appear in columns B through D. Had I come to this tab before entering my gases, none would have been displayed. Another reason it's important to enter those first. To complete this tab, enter a value in all the light green cells, even when the value is 0. The table at the top relates to the emissions limit, while the lower relates to emissions. For section 95353A, annual emissions excluding emergency events, as shown in row 36, shall not exceed the emissions limit, shown in row 10. Let's review the fields together, starting with average system capacity. This value was reported last year and should be calculated using the equation found in section 95353B of the regulation. The next field is the average CO2e capacity, which is just the average system capacity, summed across all gases I've entered and converted to metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. It will automatically populate after average system capacity is entered. Next is early action credit. If no equipment were listed on the early action credit tab, you would enter 0 here. If you did enter equipment on that tab, you need to calculate this value. As mentioned earlier, it is cumulative, including all equipment eligible for the credit starting in 2021. Making use of the equation in section 95353D and table 3, which assigns each device a credit amount based on its voltage capacity, you would calculate the total credit across all circuit breakers that qualify. The next field, data year 2021 average CO2e capacity, is only required when early action credit is claimed. For section 95353F, the total amount of early action credit claimed cannot exceed 10% of the data year 2021 average CO2e capacity. Thus, this value is used to determine the actual amount of early action credit that can be claimed, which is represented by EAC less than or equal to 10 in row 9. That value will automatically populate for you. In row 10, the emissions limit will also be auto-filled. This value is calculated using the formula I presented on slide number 7. We will demonstrate how all these fields work together later on. The next table requires entry of the values you used to calculate your emissions using the equation in section 95354.1a of the regulation. Each of the terms listed here matches a term in that equation. Fill in each green value based on your data, and certain fields will be auto-calculated for you. This table is broken into multiple subsections. The first is decrease in inventory. This is the amount of covered insulating gas stored in gas containers and carts, but not in GIE, at the beginning of the data year, minus the amount stored at year's end, which you would enter in row 15 and 16, respectively. The next section is acquisitions. This is the amount of covered insulating gas obtained through the mechanisms described in the next 4 rows. So once you enter values in rows 18 through 21, the total will be displayed in row 17. Next is disbursements. This is the amount of covered insulating gas dispersed through the mechanisms described in the next 5 rows. So just like acquisitions, once you enter values in rows 23 through 27, the total will be displayed in row 22. The final section is for the net increase in total capacity of active GIE owned and filled with covered insulating gas during the data year. This is calculated from the values you enter in rows 29 to 32. Next, you would report your annual emissions by gas in row 34, which you would calculate following the equation in the regulation. Once emissions have been entered in pounds, the next 2 values will fill in automatically. CO2e emissions are the sum of the emissions entered for all gases converted to metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and the CO2e emissions excluding emergency events are the CO2e emissions minus any emissions listed on the emergency events tab. Okay, now there's one final tab to cover, nameplate capacity adjustments. If applicable, on this worksheet, you'll list any GIE that you put through the nameplate capacity adjustment process during the data year. Note that any GIE that underwent the process will also be reported on the non-hermetically sealed GIE tab, and the entry on that tab should reflect the adjusted nameplate capacity. If you performed any adjustments, you'd enter the serial number of the device in column A, the date the process was completed in column B, and several pressure readings which are required to be recorded while performing the process in columns C through E. Those are the pressure reading 5 minutes after achieving blank off pressure, the blank off pressure of the GIE device, and the blank off pressure of the gas cart, respectively. Note the term blank off pressure is defined in the regulation. You can report these pressure values in any unit you like as long as the unit is the same, which you must report in column F. The nameplate capacity adjustment process states that if you notified CARB that you intended to perform an adjustment on a device, but did not because it had compromised integrity, you no longer need to perform that adjustment. In column G, if such a situation were to occur in the data year in which the device is removed from regular use, you would enter yes. For all GIE for which a nameplate capacity adjustment did occur during the data year, you would enter no in this column. Okay, that completes our overview of the form. I'll now pull up a semi-completed form, and we'll fill in some key data fields together so you can see how the form behaves in a couple important circumstances. The first feature is here on the non-hermetically sealed GIE tab. We'll focus in on columns N through U. In column N, you indicate whether or not each device was acquired after December 31st of 2021. And as a reminder, columns O through U are gray by default because they're not required to be completed for equipment acquired in 2021 or earlier. Because the first 4 GIE on this sample list were acquired on or before December 31st of 2021, we will enter no. And because the last device was acquired in 2022, we'll enter yes there. And notice that when we entered yes, columns O through U turned green for data entry. We'll fill in columns O through R for this device next. In column O, we'll report that it was acquired on February 1st of 2022. In column P, we'll report that it was purchased on January 1st of 2022. In column Q, we'll report that it has a short circuit current rating of 40 kA. And in column R, we'll report it is used above ground. Now we move on to columns S through U, which coupled with column V relate to SIGA. Columns S through U are only required for equipment acquired after December 31st of 2021. Column S asks for the amount of gas in the device when it was acquired. Let's enter 50 pounds. Column T asks for the additional amount of gas added to the device for activation. Let's enter 150 pounds there. Column U asks for the date gas was first added for activation. Let's enter 2/2/22. And here actually, let's pretend we made a mistake and entered 2/2/23 for the date. Note that the reporting form flagged this because we stated on the facility info tab that this is a 2022 report, and as such, we shouldn't be reporting activating anything during 2023. Okay, we'll switch this back to 2/2/22 and move on. Let's now turn our attention to column V, SIGA. As stated earlier, for GIE acquired and made active after December 31st of 2021, this value is the amount of gas inside the device when acquired, plus the additional amount of gas added for activation. For all other GIE, SIGA is the nameplate capacity, which is the design capacity of the device specified by the manufacturer as found on the device's nameplate or in manufacturer's official product specifications, or the amount determined through a nameplate capacity adjustment, if one was performed on that GIE device. SIGA is automatically populated for you, and as we can see, it properly shows the nameplate capacity from column H for the first 4 pieces of equipment, and the sum of the values entered in columns S and T for the 5th, as opposed to the nameplate capacity we had in column H. Now we'll move on to the emissions and emissions limit tab. We'll start off by entering an average system capacity, which as a reminder is calculated using the equation in section 95353B of the regulation. Let's say that after applying that equation, I calculate 242.33 pounds of SF6. Note that once I've entered the average system capacity, the average CO2e capacity automatically populates. Next is early action credit. If you were to enter 0, note that the next field, data year 2021 average CO2e capacity, remains gray because it's only required if a non-zero early action credit is reported. But if we enter 300, that cell turns green for data entry. As mentioned earlier, the total amount of early action credit claimed, represented by EAC less than or equal to 10 in row 9, cannot exceed 10% of the data year 2021 average CO2e capacity in row 8. So that would mean if my 2021 average CO2e capacity was 3,500, the maximum early action credit I could receive is 350, and I can claim the total early action credit above on row 7, 300 MT-CO2e, as you see there in row 9. Conversely, if my 2021 average CO2e capacity was only 1,000, since 10% of that is 100, that means 100 is the maximum I can claim, and you see that in row 9. Notice now that in row 10, the emissions limit is auto-calculated using the equation from section 95353G1, and based on the values I entered above, the emissions limit is 52.12 MT-CO2e. Next, in the emissions table, we've already filled out a lot of the information, but we'll do one quick section to show how the form auto-calculates some results. Here in the decrease in inventory section for SF6, we'll enter the covered insulating gas stored in containers and carts at the beginning of the data year as 100, and the covered insulating gas stored in containers and carts at the end of the data year also as 100. Using the emissions equation from section 95354.1a of the regulation, the form auto-calculates the value in row 14 as 0. Finally, at the bottom of this tab, after applying the equation in section 95354.1a, let's say our annual emissions are 5 pounds. We'll enter that here. Once we've done so, the CO2e emissions and CO2e emissions, excluding emergency events, auto-populate. The former displays a value of 51.71, which is just the 5 pounds of emissions converted to units of MT-CO2e. And the second is also 51.71 because it equals the value directly above it, minus any emissions from emergency events listed on that tab, of which there are none. Okay, we've now completed our sample reporting forms, so we'll switch back to our presentation slides and explain how to submit the annual report once completed. Entities subject to CARB's mandatory greenhouse gas reporting regulation must submit annual reports using CalEGRIT. As was the case last year, CalEGRIT users will directly upload their completed spreadsheet, generate the report, and certify. CalEGRIT has built-in data validation checks that will flag potential issues. Some of these flags may prevent report submission if the issue is not corrected. Hence, we recommend allocating sufficient time to work with this feature prior to the June 1st reporting deadline. These checks are in place to help you identify potential errors prior to submission and to ensure more accurate data reporting overall. Reporting entities not subject to the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting regulation are still encouraged to report via CalEGRIT, but they may also email the completed reporting form and assigned attestation statement to CARB staff. Our email address is energy@arb.ca.gov. Note per the regulatory amendments, CARB will no longer be accepting annual reports through the mail. Over the years reviewing your annual reports, we have noticed a number of common mistakes, and we wanted to take some time to clarify the proper way to report these data. First, average system capacity does not include inactive GIE or hermetically sealed GIE. Only non-hermetically sealed GIE that meet the regulatory definition of active GIE at some point in the data year need to be included in this calculation. While we explained how to calculate average system capacity earlier, we'll do so again given the number of mistakes we saw in last year's reports. To calculate average system capacity, you multiply the SIGA of each device that was active at some point during the data year by the number of days it was active, and then divide the result by the number of days in the data year. You then sum the results for all GIE that were active at some point during the data year. Another common mistake we saw last year in this calculation was reporters using the number of equipment they own for the denominator, capital D sub I, instead of the number of days in the data year. We also want to highlight that you need to include all containers and carts in your annual report. Note that this includes ones you do not own. For example, containers brought on site by gas handling companies when they're adding or removing gas from your GIE. This also includes empty containers that you own or store on your property designed to contain covered insulating gas. You must include in your annual report all GIE that were owned for at least one day during the data year, including those you disposed of during the data year and those that were inactive all year. Also, you should only include GIE that meet the regulatory definition of hermetically sealed on the hermetically sealed GIE tab of the reporting form. The reported seal type needs to be consistent with the regulatory definition, regardless of how the device is described in manufacturer materials. Finally, if you have any GIE that are considered removed from regular use per the regulation, the gas needs to be removed and accounted for. Both the SIGA of the device and the gas recovered need to be included in the emissions calculation so that any gas that leaked from that device is reported as emitted. Here we explain how to amend annual reports when an error is discovered. Whenever an error is discovered, your first step should be to notify CARB staff as soon as possible and explain what the error is. Second, you may send staff a revised reporting form for review. CARB staff will then look at the changes, make sure everything looks good, and unlock your CalEgret account so the report can be officially resubmitted and recertified. The benefit of this approach is that if staff review the revised reports in advance of your official resubmission, you'll only have to do that step once. Note that the regulation states each day or portion thereof that any report contains an incomplete, untrue, or inaccurate data field shall constitute a single separate violation of this subarticle. Therefore, when an error is discovered, please try to fix it as soon as possible. Finally, regarding record keeping, the original regulation required all records be retained for a minimum of 3 years, but in the amendments, we increased this to 5 years for consistency with other CARB programs. This change requires a bit of a transition period, so at the present time, all records generated before January 1st of 2022 must be kept for 3 years, and those generated after this date must be kept for 5. Okay, we've now reached the end of the presentation and we'll shift over to the questions and answers portion of the webinar. As a reminder, to ask a question, click on the raise hand icon on the GoToWebinar toolbar on your screen. Carrie will call on audience members who raise their hands, and once you are called upon, you will need to unmute yourself by clicking on the red microphone icon. Carrie, do we have any hands raised yet?
All right. Hi, everyone. This is Carrie Bylan. And as Brian mentioned, I'll be calling on folks who raise their hand to ask a question. We do have one here, Ram Verna. I am going to unmute you right now, and I'd ask that you unmute on your side as well, and then introduce yourself and ask your question. Okay, you are unmuted. I think I have unmuted you, and
yes. Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. This is Ram Verma with California Department of Water Resources. My question is, if we revise the nameplate capacity, will it trigger revising the reports for the previous years? And if it does, for how many years we have to go back and when we have to report those revised reports?
Thanks for that question. The answer is no. If you perform a nameplate capacity adjustment, the regulation specifies that you will use that revised capacity for reporting purposes in the year in which the adjustment was made and then going forward. There's no In fact, you should not go back and revise previously submitted reports.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next, I will go to McKay Quinn. I have unmuted you. You should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. So my name is McKay Quinn. I'm with Trinity Consultants. I was just wondering, based on the recent availability of the updated form for reporting year 2022, will CARB be extending the submittal deadline to allow companies time to get used to the updated reporting form, or will the same submittal deadline be applicable?
I can answer that. So the reporting deadline is specified in the regulation, and so it cannot be extended. We have released the reporting form, excuse me, at a similar time that we had done last year. So our understanding was that would be sufficient time to enter your data into the new reporting form.
Thank you.
Okay, next let's go to Kayleen Spear.
Hello, this is Kayleen Spear. I'm with Reading Electric Utility. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, my question is, Brian, you had mentioned about all the containers and carts, including those that were not owned or stored on GIE owners' property, and those that are empty must be reported. But you mentioned something about this included if gas companies come and they are bringing containers that they're then filling on site. Can you repeat what you said and talk more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So if, say, you're activating a new device for the first time, a lot of times it'll come only partially charged with SF6 gas, and perhaps a contractor or someone would be hired to come on site with the remainder of the gas and fill it up. So if that situation occurs, the container that they bring with them needs to be included in your annual report. You would indicate that the container is being reported prior to its use and enter how much SF6 it had in it when it was brought on site. And then when it's taken away, you would, on a separate line item in the report, indicate you're reporting the amount of gas it had when it was removed, and then indicate how much gas it had at that point in time, so that we can see, the difference between those two values would presumably be the amount that was added to the device. And the same would be true at retirement. If a device is being decommissioned and someone comes on site, maybe even with an empty container, to receive the gas, you would report that an empty container came on site with 0 SF6 in it, and then report on a separate line item how much gas it had in it when it was taken away. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Okay, next we'll go to Melissa Magler. Sorry if I got your name wrong. I believe you're unmuted and you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, I am just downloading the form and playing with it a little bit, and apologies if I missed that in the presentation, but it looks like on the emissions, emissions limit tab, the columns B and C and D that we're showing in the presentation aren't appearing, and I'm wondering if that's because that just means based on the inputs that there weren't any emissions in our case, or if that's something that you can advise me on how to unhide those columns.
Sure. So this is an example of why it's important to fill out the facility info tab on the reporting form first. There's a section there where you list all the gases that you have. And once you've entered them on the facility info tab, you should find that the emissions limit tab will show those gases. So as Lon is showing here, it's currently blank because she hasn't picked any gases, but Lon, maybe if you just want to pick one and show that it pops up.
So in my case, I did input the year, and yes, I caught that bit. So I did input SF6 for the covered insulating gas, and it populated the global warming potential in that facility info tab, but it's still not showing anything in the emissions limit tab for me.
Oh, okay.
So maybe we can connect afterwards, and you might be able to help me, Brian.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, please do follow up. And we'll
Thank
try
you.
to troubleshoot that.
Great.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, we'll take a look at that too, just to make sure there's not an error on our end. Okay, thank you. I do not see any other raised hands, so maybe we'll do a final call, give it just a minute to see if anybody thinks of any questions.
This is Lan here. I just want to mention very quickly to the previous question about the gas populating. Please ensure that the macros are enabled on your form when you open the form. It may ask you on top to enable macros. So this feature would not work if the macros are not enabled. So just have that check.
Thank you, Lon. Okay, and we've got a couple more hands raised here. I'll start with Bobby Howie. I have unmuted you. There you go. You can ask your question.
Just a quick question. If we're transferring an SF6 unit, not to decommission it, out of state for use in another state, how would we report that in the form?
Let's see. That might be a question that we should follow up on after the fact. I think it's definitely the case that if it was owned at some point during 2022, you would need to include it in your equipment list. In order to make sure we get you a complete and accurate answer, can you email us that after the meeting, and we'll think about what reporting status would be appropriate to select for that one?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, next let's go to Julia Ryan. You should be unmuted. Hopefully you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Just a question, and you might have mentioned this at the beginning and maybe I missed it, but will a copy of these slides be available?
Julia, I'm sorry to interrupt you, and I hope it's not just on my end, but I'm having trouble hearing you. I can hear something, but it's very faint.
How about now?
Better, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I just had a quick question, and you might have mentioned this at the beginning, but will a copy of the slides be available?
Yes, we will be posting a copy of the slides on our website soon.
Great, thank you.
Okay. And next, Vicente Martinez. I am unmuting you. You can ask your question.
Just a general, simple question. We sample our systems, and sometimes, we send those analysis to a lab, and it's about 500 milliliters per sample. So there's a volume that's removed from the system. I'm not sure if I kind of stepped out, if that was covered during the training or not.
Yeah, I think for small amounts that are sent out for samples, could you send us an email with a specific question, kind of explaining the scenario, and we can follow up after the webinar?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Next question from Pradnya Jadhav. You should be unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I just have a quick question, and I probably might have missed while explaining, but I'm looking at the form here, and I'm on the tab where it says that facility info. I have, the third column where it says that mass share of covered insulating gas and gas blend, right? So if we have just one kind of gas, which is SF6, which is in switchgear, that is just one kind of gas. So what would be the value? Is it kind of 100% of SF6 is the insulating gas in that switchgear? How do we express that in that column?
And in that case, you can actually just leave this blank. You would only need to fill this column in if the gas is actually used in a blend.
I see. Got it. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, again, I don't see any other raised hands, but sounds like you all are downloading the form and taking a look, which is great. Oh, let's see. I thought I saw a raised hand, but then it went away. And just want to encourage to, as has been stated, to reach out to the, Lon, if you could go back to the slide, the energy@arb.ca.gov. Please do reach out if you have questions as you're working with this, with the revised form. And now I see a question from Phil Bolin. You should be unmuted. You can ask your question. But you're still muted on your end. So if you can unmute on your end, we can't hear you yet.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I have a question about the original intent was to get a report on and then set emission limits and bans and early action credits for SF6. This has now been extended to other fluorinated gases on the basis of GWP. But what is CARB's plan as the EPA adds some of the gases that are being used now in GIE to their toxic release inventory from a water resources board viewpoint?
I can give a preliminary answer to that. And if you need to ask additional questions, maybe we can do follow up. But the amended regulation was expanded from the prior focus on SF6 only to include any other covered insulating gas that is used in gas insulated equipment. And covered insulating gas, as was described in the slides, is any insulating gas that has a GWP greater than 1. So we do not specify whether that is a fluorinated gas or not. So just want to make that clear because it sounded like the framing of your question might have been a little different. If you're referring to the, I also can't comment on the EPA action. So again, we can follow up on that. So is there anything, in case I didn't answer your question sufficiently, did you want to clarify anything?
No, I think you've done an excellent job in explaining your present reporting requirements. And as a consultant to both OEMs and utilities, we're trying to look ahead to what we might expect as we make equipment and insulating covered gas choices as to what's going to happen next. The bans on SF6 at various ratings after a certain number of years was coming for a long time. We could expect that. The early action credits make some sense in relation to that. But there's also how to meet the emissions limit over the next 50 years of operation of these utility grids. Will something else be added if water resources both from the EPA and from the California Water Resources Board, start to look very closely at these fluorinated gases and their impact on the water resources in terms of persistence and bioaccumulation.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And for the purposes of this webinar, because we are talking about the current regulation and the associated reporting required, we can't speculate on what might happen in the future that could, but of course we are interested in ensuring that entities can comply, have a reasonable path to comply with the regulation. So if there, is something that comes up that would necessitate an amendment to the regulation, that is something we would evaluate at that time. So we can certainly have a follow-up discussion if you'd like. Please do follow up with us. And in terms of, I just want to say one comment regarding, you had mentioned the ban, which I believe we refer, well, if you're talking about SF6, I'm not sure if you're referring to the phase out that's actually within our regulation.
Yeah, the phase out, the ban.
Yep. So we can go into more detail if needed offline. But we I will comment that we do have in place in the amended regulation both a phase out schedule that we had developed based on our understanding of availability in the future of non-SF6 alternatives for varying types of equipment. And there is also a phase out exemption process that we have included in the regulation for those circumstances when it is not feasible, according to specific criteria laid out in the regulation, to be able to acquire a non-SF6 device. So I won't go through the details of that here, but we're certainly happy to discuss that with you if you'd like.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Brian, did you have anything to add to my response there?
No, thank you, Carrie.
Okay. All right. I am again at a point where I don't see any hands raised. We'll give it another minute. Okay, well, in the interest of giving folks 44 minutes back, we can conclude. If we see another hand raised, I'll comment. But other than that, as mentioned several times, please do follow up with us if you have other questions following this webinar, and I will turn it over to Brian to close us out.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carrie. Just a couple final reminders in addition to the opportunity to follow up with us via email at the email address shown on your screen, energy@arb.ca.gov. We will be posting the presentation slides and a video recording of this webinar on our webpage soon. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and goodbye.